Salve o Senhor do Mal, o cineasta maldito. Sé do povo, sé da terra, sé do Caixão. Today on the Outskirts Film Podcast, we're talking about the embodiment of evil himself, O Estranho Mundo de Sé do Caixão, also known as Coffin Joe. And we're actually not talking about José Mojica Marins himself. We're only focusing on the films that he made adjacent to or within like the Sé do Caixão mythos, if you will. And this is the Outskirts Film Podcast going back to the more sordid realms of filmmaking where we abandon all hope and fully embrace depravity. I've had like some experience with Sé do Caixão before, but also it's a great way of approaching Chris and Oiku within this kind of like very visceral experience that is watching these films also in quick succession, which I don't think they're meant to see that way. Welcome, Chris and Oiku, as always.
Hello.
Thank you for this great introduction.
And perhaps to start off, I just wanted to see what was your relationship to Sé do Caixão, because I think his figure in Latin America, well, in Brazil it's a whole another subject we'll get into, but like in Latin America he's known as this kind of like iconographic figure, so he's kind of like ingrained, even if you haven't seen the films, as some sort of like cult icon. But from the outside, what was your relationship to Mojica Marins and Sé do Caixão as a figure, and this first approximation to his films?
I'm not giving a very positive image of my cinephilia here, but my first encounter with, I think, Sé do Caixão was through the poster of At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. Because when we decided to make this episode, I was going through his filmography, and I realized that I knew that poster very well without knowing anything about the filmmaker, but the poster itself had a really strong impression on me, and I was like, oh, that's that film. To be fair, I was expecting something on the notes of Lucio Fulci, which I was like, oh yeah, I'm okay, I'm ready for this, but to be honest, I wasn't ready. I after the first two films of the trilogy, I just, as I told you, like I felt really dead inside, and it was a strong experience to go through for me.
I mean, the name José Mojica Marins was a name that I knew, and I knew some people who had written texts defending his films, talking about his films and so on, but I'm not sure I really dug into it, even though the character of Coffin Joe, Sé do Caixão, was kind of always there as something I was aware of as a kind of Brazilian character, or how would you call it? But I think both the poster and the name of the film, actually a film that I still haven't seen, Exorcismo Negro, with a lot of filmmakers, I recognize them from my torrenting days. Not that those days are over, but from the days of kind of taking loads and loads and loads of files and keeping them on hard drives and seeing those little AVI files and the names of the films, and I could imagine what those films would be. And I think Exorcismo Negro was one of those films.
And also something I like that really fascinated me was this marketing approach to change his name to Coffin Joe. I don't think I've ever seen or encountered, and maybe there is, but I personally didn't know any example of this case, like a really national cultural object being transported in the context of cinema, transported or being popularized in an international context through a different name. Maybe in the international context, it's still a genre element popular with the horror fans rather than in the more generalized cinephilia.
Yeah, actually, there's something to that, and that transitional period. There's like the Brazilian timeline in terms of like how they were received and how they were produced. Also, like the international sensation it became in Europe and in Latin America, and then it came later on to the United States, almost in the 90s, where there was like this VHS release. That's actually where the Coffin Joe name is supposed to have come from. And you see like in Demonios Maravilhas, which is one of the like self-made docudrama thing, but in that you see a lot of clippings from international like outlets, particularly in France. I think the Le Grand Fantastique is one of the magazines that was very big into like promoting like Mojica Marins as like this figure, and they still respected the Sé do Caixão like name.
On the Wikipedia page of Sé do Caixão in French, it's also like in brackets says Pépé du Cercueil, which sounds like a, I don't know, cartoon character rather than like a horror film hero, anti-hero.
he is kind of like a cartoon character. When you were mentioning like what kind of like parallel there is, I don't think like the specific like circumstances of like the Celo Caixão figure kind of translate anywhere else, but the closest I can think is kind of like Cantinflas in Mexico or like Tintan or those kind of like pop figures that transcended cinema, but they weren't filmmakers themselves. So there's also this kind of like very specific aspect of Mujica Marins of what he created. I think is very unique.
Maybe one challenging aspect of as a filmmaker is that I think when we discuss filmmakers here, we tend to project or like reflect on this auteur idea of as if all the filmmakers have this big project of their careers, of something that they want to achieve through their films. But I think in Mujica's case, that's a bit of a complicated issue. Transpose so-called like artistic project on Celo Caixão film.
So yeah, within the Celo Caixão mythos, I think there's each iteration is kind of like a dialogue with some like aesthetic trends that are going on in counterculture and like in horror cinema and like in cult cinema or whatever. So I don't think there's perhaps this like authorial like reading of like the Celo Caixão films. To me, this kind of like fan cult figure countercultural aspect. It's even has more like prevalence over this like perhaps traditional authorial intent, which I think also helps building this like reputation he's had, which hasn't really come from like cinephilia itself, which is also like, an interesting topic we can like touch upon.
Yeah, and I also think that one of the things that makes these Celo Caixão films special as a whole group is the kind of authorial bait that they offer a cinephile viewer, because there are 8 films, and I mean, I think in the third film in this series, it already becomes very meta. It becomes a kind of self-interrogating object very, very quickly. In the fourth film, there's already this like public perception of the figure. What is the media context of this figure? It's very strange how the films, how Mujica himself kind of seemed to really quickly gravitate towards that.
But it still steers you away from the more aesthetic and formal elements, and then leads you to focus rather on the media aspect, popularity, like popular culture already on a second level. So I think maybe the expression you use, bait, is correct, because I think he's a marketing genius in that sense. He never stopped promoting through TV programs, ads. Even I think he had I read somewhere that he had a deodorant called Mysterio, and Celo Caixão Volkswagen, fabricated
Amazing.
from 1609 to 70. Like these are, I think he's a marketing genius. This is like a pure entertainment mentality, which is also can be interpreted as a counterculture approach to cinema itself by attacking to this idea of auteurism, using its own own marketing devices against the like highbrow intellectual culture, because Mujica was an autodidact. So I think that also justifies his own presence in the more mainstream film industry.
I think it's very funny just to think that someone wants to smell like Celo Caixão after seeing what he does in those films, and he's like literally like drenched in dirt and like all kinds of fluids. But yeah, while you were describing, I was kind of thinking of like perhaps what happened to like John Waters, so this kind of like pop icon figure that's simultaneously ingrained within the mainstream. A lot of people know the John Waters figure, but haven't actually seen any of his films. Has this almost like a Warholian kind of like pop art kind of way of like mass production of like this like lowbrow aspect that still perhaps that's all this tension that like is always around like the work of like Mujica Marins.
O que é a vida? É o princípio da morte. O que é a morte? É o fim da vida. O que é a existência? É a continuidade do sangue. O que é o sangue? É a razão da existência.
Maybe to give it a bit of biographical context to our listeners, which also joins to the idea of self-mythologizing, because I think even from his very early age, the fact that he's born in like a Friday of 13 Mars in Sao Paulo, it starts already from there. He's born into a family of Spanish immigrants, and at some point when he was very young, his father started to own a cinema, so his childhood was just full of watching films and reading comic books. And he started from a very young age making this really early amateur films with people living in the neighborhood. This really makeshift shoestring quality in his films that we're going to discuss very soon comes from this period, even before Zeudo Caixão appeared in his filmography.
Like a lot of like Italian comedies were also being shown in Latin America. A lot of like Italian melodramas, Mexican melodramas. So popular cinema, these kind of expressions. Those were the films he was watching. There was never like this kind of like cinephilia point where he was like, oh yeah, I'll try to emulate the great masters. He was always like looking to like trashy horror films, sexist Italian comedies, like Mexican melodramas. So, and when you read about like this first attempts at creating this like theater troupe, it was very much so like creating this kind of like exalted sensation in acting. I haven't actually seen the ones he did, but it's interesting to me. There's like a very popular like Spanish like melodrama in Latin America that always plays during like Easter called Marcelino Pan y Vino, and he actually the film he made before like the first Zeudo Caixão film, Meu Destino en Tuas Manos, is kind of like an attempt of doing that, which to me is very very funny because it's basically kind of like an orphan's like a lighthearted orphan story, and 1 year afterwards he's doing A Medianoite Levaré su alma.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, you can imagine another universe where he had more of a Fulci arc and that it took him longer to really get his footing. But in this case, like, he was, I guess, fortunate that he had this kind of vision that he's often talked about, where he was preparing a film and he went to sleep and he had a nightmare about an undertaker coming out of a cemetery and dragging him into the cemetery and forcing him to look at his death date on his tombstone. And he was refusing to look. And then when he woke up, he kind of conceptualized this character. He has this great line about how the first film his dad took him to see was an educational documentary about venereal diseases. And he said, like, from that, he learned everything he needed to know, and he never learned anything from another film ever again.
But still, in a way, these codes, all these things are also kind of against the auteurism that we want to just impose on him, because you can't like trace a line of tradition, or it kind of impeds you from like projecting that idea, and which I also liked. It's challenging to think of him as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, even from the first film, you can really see that it wasn't meant to be this kind of like a sprawling like saga of films.
Because he kills him at the end.
True.
To me, that film also, like in terms of like history of Brazilian cinema, is kind of like an outlier, because it isn't really linked to what was happening in Brazil at the time, which was this transition period from like cinema novo, which is this moment in time where like Glauber Rocha and like other filmmakers were doing like more like a socially focused, like low budget filmmaking. But at the same moment, like in the mid 60s, there was this discussion within like Brazil about like how cinema novo had become, I wouldn't say gentrified, but kind of like commodified by European like institutions. So it's like the start of cinema marginal, which was this kind of like countercultural like rejection of like those more like middlebrow like ways of doing filmmaking. But even then, they weren't really touching the same kind of material that Mojica Marins was. So that's very interesting that he basically does like a straight up like gothic horror film, way more extreme than most gothic horror films at the time. But still, there's not really like a genealogy like I can find even in Brazilian film, which makes it even more interesting to think about.
But even as a genre, from the genre perspective, it's kind of challenging to either hate, like, appreciate the character. Zombies, zombies, they're evil. But here we have this man. He's just a man. There's no supernatural. I mean, he's presented as this man who has this superhuman abilities, but it's not to the point of having supernatural abilities. He's just a man. So there's no supernatural forces that push him to act the way he acts. He's just like, he has this very a firm belief about how humans should behave, and the weak ones, they're not entitled to live because they're weak, and they have weak bodies, weak minds, and they believe in God. He wants humans that are like, even when I explain these, it sounds really fucked up. A psychopath is kind of defy the logic, but this man believes that he is acting according to a certain scientific logic.
Yeah, it's like the first horror icon that directly like quotes dialectic materialism in a way, which is kind of interesting, like a full quote to have on your posters. I guess like Satanism at the time was also doing this, like in the countercultural way of like like intermeshing like libertarian ideas with like pulp like literature and horror films with like this Nietzschean, the construction of the Übermensch and all those things. The construction of Caixão himself as a figure takes from the Western Mortician in a way, but also like a lot of like candomblé aspects, which is like this like a folk religion in Brazil, kind of like a postmodern amalgamation of things, and then becoming like the thing you can see like on deodorants on the supermarket becomes kind of like an interesting career path.
The connection with like later Brazilian film movements like Boca do Lixo, Cinema Marginal, you can sense in, if you read what those people like Scanzel, Júlio Baricani, or from Cinema Novo, Globo Rocha, you can feel like the admiration they have for this man, that they often express it in kind of backhanded ways. So Globo Rocha called him a primitive, even when he was praising him. Scanzel used a similar image, that he's a kind of more of a force than a filmmaker, you know, that he's like unleashed something, that's like he just exists somehow. And I think they were jealous in some way of that, because, you know, they were people who were going to the streets, making films really cheaply, shooting black and white as cheap as possible, trying to get at a certain ugliness of society. You know, 5 or 10 years before, José de Caixão, who was this like cultural icon from more or less from the start, was touching on the same things. And I think that's, for me, about that first film, At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. There is also the aspect that I think that Mojica made that film in a very different way, probably, than those later filmmakers did. I read that Crew would sleep for a while, but Mojica wouldn't sleep. He would go to the supermarket and he would get amphetamine. The official dose was that you should take 1 or 2 per day maximum, and he would take 20, and he would stay awake for 72 or 96 hours just working on the film. It was like that, you know, like this kind of prodigious madman figure in a way, like not so much an intellectual who's planning everything out, but just kind of powering on and trying to make everything.
What you said about his working routine makes me also think of how he was already blurring the lines between his persona as a filmmaker and his character, which gets even blurry in his meta films in the 70s, which I found really interesting, because this superhuman quality, I think he was already, while working in his first film then.
Yeah, even like I think before recording we were mentioning the cult-like aspect of this theater troupe he had. Like his first film, he sold his car to finance part of it, but also like he created this kind of like weird like pyramid scheme cooperative within his theater troupe, where like all his students were part of like the funding like aspect of the film, and,
yes.
They all had shares of the film.
Yes. He presented it as like how every filmmaker should do it. He's like, I figured it out. Like this is like, you don't need to finance films. Like, you can just like get like go to a restaurant or go to your dentist and say like, you just buy a little share in my film.
Not all the technical crew was paid in that film as well, which you can really see like there's only so much you can do as like, I don't know, Andrea Tonacci or like Osvaldo Candeias, when you're like thinking, oh, we have to take like Samuel Fuller and create that, and then you're seeing like Mojica Martins is scamming like teenagers and like selling cars. It's like no, that's the real way of getting there.
Yeah, I mean, all of the behind-the-scenes stories are pretty amoral, if not immoral. and that film is like, you just feel that like incredible invention like bursting out of the seams, even if you don't necessarily know that it's like, you know, he exploded a bomb on set in order to like scare the non-professional actors into giving good performances, or like the park in that first film where a lot of the action takes place. They went the night before and they dug trees out of a local park and brought them to the studio, and then just moved the trees around to make it seem like it was a real park. So yeah, I like more or less all these films, but like that's what's very special about that first film to me, is like it's very raw, very much kind of a UFO of film history. Like you could imagine that he would never make another film after this in a way, but somehow miraculously he did.
Nada existe, somente a vida. Nada é mais forte que a minha descrença. Destrua-me! Eu não creio em nada. Quero a prova do castigo! Mentira!
The fact that he gets haunted by the forces of the beyond, let's say, in the first film, he gets sort of punished by those. And when we arrive at the beginning of the second film, it's presented as if nothing happened in the first film, or he's still defying the forces of beyond.
Yeah, actually, that first film actually has like a very like moralistic center, which I don't think. The rest of them I think quickly go away from that. Well, he tried to make a couple films after like the first like Solo Caixão film. I think there's a western I really want to see, but I don't think it's very available. The thing that I recall the most, and I like surprised me the most about the second Solo Caixão film, Esta Noche Encarnaré no Teu Cadáver. The jump formally that happens between like these two films in 3 years to me is quite astonishing, particularly towards like the end of this film. The way he approaches these more like psychedelic elements that will basically define the next crop of like Solo Caixão films. So I remember the first time I watched this film, I was like literally like blown away by just like seeing this sequence. Kind of remind me of a sequence in like a late 60s Santo film. But when Santo and Blue Demon go to hell, and it's shot like almost like Segundo de Shomon sequence, I kind of feel the same kind of like pure magic, pure illusion, kind of carnivalesque sense of like wonder in how it's like framed, which kind of like goes back to that to me.
Felt like a bad trip. The psychedelic trip to the hell was like a bad trip, especially because of the sound element. I think there's this really, I don't want to say annoying, but really creepy aspect of the sound, because it's so monotonous and it's just this people crying and weeping in such a tone, really a heart-wrenching sound that never goes away through all these sequence, even though the image changes, even it's so colorful. I think that this consistent weeping and crying and heart-wrenching sound really, I was like, when this will end?
I wonder how, like, what would be the ideal scenario for watching all these films for the first time as podcast research, because Oiku and I had kind of the opposite experience, I guess. You watched them in order in an intense period, and I watched them completely out of order over a longer period. And I think neither of them really worked as methods, because you were too overexposed in a way to the like sheer brutality and horror of those first films. I would love to see This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse again, because when we decided on this idea of Zeta Caixão, it wasn't really immediately clear to me like what are the films we're talking about. So I jumped ahead, and I jumped ahead too far to a film, Hallucinations of a Deranged Mind, which is a film made of the odds and ends of all of the hell sequences from the previous films. Like, I don't really like that movie, but it's like very fascinating for many reasons. But essentially it's a clip show of these hellish visions from the Caixão films to an extent that's almost Warholian. Then I jumped to The Awakening of the Beast, which also is like has a lot of hell sequences and so on. So then I thought, oh my God, is this going to be everything that all these movies are going to have? As the ones that said, Segundo Shimon sequences of people having pitchforks jabbed in their ass. So then I go back to the second one, and it's like very similar to the first film for a lot of it, even though there is this kind of differing quality to the images. And then what happens towards the end? He goes to hell. It took me a while to really get on that film's wavelength for that reason. Once you arrive to those final sequences where he's like hunted in the swamp, very powerful and indefinable images that really like stick with me, and so that ending kind of retrospectively like sort of reframed the whole film for me. So I would love to see it again.
I don't think I really enjoy the hell sequences in his filmography overall, but one thing I really like was this flesh wall that appears in the first image. We see this wall made of flesh. Not any human parts are visible. It's just flesh that cries. And that image really stayed with me. And then we get to the point of where we see real people suffering, like organs or whatever. But I think the real powerful image of this sequence was the flesh, just ambiguous, this mass of flesh.
Yeah, I think we haven't really touched upon how like the carnal aspect of these films and how prevalent like the I wouldn't say like body horror per se, but just like mutilation and like the extremes he goes to like showcase these kind of like sequences and this kind of like confrontation, exploitation in that sense. Because it was also one of the things that surprised me when I first approached these films. It was given the time period, I wasn't really expecting it to be like that like graphic or that intense. I was thinking like at most maybe like early Mario Bava or something like that. And then you see like a lot of like necrophiliac aspects, a lot of like limbs being torn, like sexual violence element is pretty prevalent in these films. That aspect actually came to me the first time when I was watching the O Extraño Mundo de Celo Caixão, because this one is an anthology film which actually has an introduction where like the Celo Caixão character kind of like almost like a Hitchcock kind of like, or like Vincent Price character just like introduces the kind of like horrors we'll be seeing, almost like a juvenile thing at the end where he shows up like Mojica Marins as a doctor called Wasiak Odes, which is Celo Caixão in reverse. And he's this like vile psychotic professor also doing like sadistic rituals, but he's like a different character because he doesn't have the same outfit, so it's like a different skin for Celo Caixão.
Bizarro Celo Caixão.
Yeah, the other two like narratives in there. One is a kind of like a very classic kind of like doll maker, like with body parts kind of like story. And there's the second one is kind of interesting because kind of like meshes together the necrophilia and like food fetish, which to me is quite like a novel approach. I would like to see more like a tradition of those films. I think by this point he clearly sees that the Celo Caixão character as his go-to in a way. And despite clearly not wanting to make a Celo Caixão film, he still has to ingrain the character to sell some tickets, I guess.
I think that's why I liked Awakening of the Beast the most, because it's his, I think, most serious film. Brings a social commentary about drug culture. Like, we can discuss whether it's valid or
a cynical cash-in.
Yeah, but I think there's a social aspect that's quite intentional from his perspective. So that's something I like. But I also liked how the structure is at least a bit different. The trip itself is something you can't control. So all these like trip sequences, like with different young people, are kind of unfolds in a more spontaneous way than Celo Caixão films, let's say.
It's also this kind of Hitchcockian, or you could say Fulcian gesture, thinking about Cat in the Brain, to like put yourself as a filmmaker, as a brand, at the center of the object, therefore giving yourself a sort of like cover to keep making movies. I mean, clearly, like you can just tell from his career that there was some ambiguity about being the Celo Caixão guy, because you can see him trying to wriggle away from it a little bit, but then eventually just giving up and you know, embracing that, you know, this idea that he became this pop cultural figure, or whether this film is trying to make him into one, because, you know, like in this film, he tells the patients that he's given them LSD, and in fact it's a placebo, and it's just the very image of the poster of Coffin Joe, of the strange case of Coffin Joe, that gives him these hallucinations.
But I wonder if there's a reversal of this image, because I feel like he was popular on TV and he used that image to make films later in his career. So I think the popularity in TV kind of fed the films. It wasn't the other way around.
In Brazil, it's common that if a woman gets like very long fake nails that are a little trashy, people will be like, she went a little Celo Caixão today. It penetrates to that level. But yeah, what my friends mentioned is that he's known as a figure. He's not necessarily known as a filmmaker.
No, but it's interesting because I think there's a contradictory aspect, the way he used his self-image to promote all these films. But I think there's also a part of him that is he doesn't care about that image that much as a normal filmmaker would, which allowed him to continue even if he wasn't that much popular as a filmmaker. But he still like made films of 80s and 90s, maybe not as this like prominent figure, but he just like, let's say, quote unquote, survived. It wasn't like a proper downfall, like maybe had to let go of Celo Caixão for a while to survive, and it worked.
Yeah, I think Exorcismo Negro kind of shows that in a way, because I was also reading, like, in fact, that happened on Despertar da Vestra, that he didn't really want to make a Celo Caixão film, but the producers did ask him to do that. And also there was like this aspect we were talking about, like he's always kind of like relating and dialoguing with the the culture, quote unquote, at the time, because he said like the film came from an impulse when he thought like at the time everyone just wanted to do two things: to talk to God and to take LSD. Also jumping on the bandwagon of this like sexploitation and like drug exploitation films, and eventually Cedro Caixão came in and this tacked on element to that film. Despertar da Besta was kind of a breaking point in his career because that film suffered a lot from the censorship at the time. For a long time, it wasn't actually shown in Brazil as they intended. I think it was until the 90s when it was shown in the VHS tapes in the US that it was actually seen as intended. Like I think 20 minutes were cut off from the original cut of that film in the period where there was like the military dictatorship in Brazil. They also had like a very strict manner of seeing which things that could be considered political, could be considered like heretical, couldn't be shown. But in this case, it did mark like a important like break, and he shows because the next Cedro Caixão film, like Exorcismo Negro, came like 4 or 5 years later, while at this point he was doing like at least like a character appearance like every year or so.
José Mojica Marins, mais conhecido como Zé do Caixão, autor, diretor, ator e produtor de filmes e programas de televisão. Glauber Rocha, aplaudido e festejado em todo o mundo como o líder da nova cinematografia brasileira, considera Zé do Caixão um primitivista e um cineasta puro. Anselmo Duarte, premiado em Cannes, considera Zé do Caixão um diretor de recursos inegáveis. A maioria da crítica não o leva a sério. Zé do Caixão, um cineasta ou um farsante? Culpado ou inocente? É o que o Tribunal Popular da Verdade vai procurar saber a partir deste momento.
Those next two films, Exorcismo Negro and The Strange Hostel of Naked Pleasures, those are kind of the last ones before this sort of prolonged period of, I don't want to say stagnation, but he was just trying to get anything made, and there is this kind of obligatory turn to sexploitation films and pornography. Where do you stand on those two films?
He tried to create like another figure, being tired of the Cedro Caixão and the controversy. There's like the Finis Hominis films, which the first one, The End of Man, I think has kind of become also like a cult film. And then he has the sequel to that, which was for a long time also wasn't shown in Brazil, Quando os Deuses Adormecem, when the gods fall asleep. So he did try to do something different, more like in the psychedelic line in the 70s, but eventually Exorcismo Negro to me is kind of like most interesting like of his meta films, because in this one it's clearly like Mojica Marins has appeared as a filmmaker before, but in this case he's like the actual protagonist, and there's like kind of like supernatural duel about who is the actual like genius figure.
Yeah, I think there are some formal experimentations in that film. The close-ups, this really weird fisheye kind of like close-ups in the hell sequences, for instance, are quite new, different than the earlier ones. But I wonder, I think what could have been more interesting, at least that's what I felt while watching it, the character Cedro Caixão is like consistently implied, but we never see him as a menace, as this like figure throughout the film. He literally appears near the end. So I think it creates a like imbalance between those. Like I would have liked to see him more throughout the film, or at least like in form of a suggestion, because I think maybe to really use the popularity of The Exorcist, through the first half of the film, we don't get to see him as this menace, but rather characters being possessed by this invisible force that we get to learn what it is in the second half. We get the implications because there's this discussion about the existence of Cedro Caixão, and he says, no, he's not real. He's just a product of my fantasy. So he denies his existence. But then he just disappears from the whole discussion with the family he goes to stay with during the Christmas. But it's a good Christmas film.
Yeah, I almost kind of forget that it's supposed to be kind of, as you were saying, kind of like a assignment film that's supposed to be like an Exorcist like knockoff, but he just does this like a meta like thing with the film. I think at this point also like the figure of Cedro Caixão in this like these films, and also the next one, A Estranha Hospedaria dos Prazeres, like the Cedro Caixão and Outskirts da Besta, he's more kind of this like metaphysical presence, not really like a character per se, but this kind of like embodiment of pure like, I wouldn't say even like evil, but just like pure like unrestrained, like the heat of like a Brazilian consciousness.
Just find it a bit contradictory also that he appears as the representative of the hell in the film, whereas he was haunted by the hell in the previous film. So it's he embodies the supernatural or evil force. Like he I think he's not Satan himself, but the fact that he's associated with the forces of the evil is kind of like a, I don't know, inner contradiction there with the whole idea of Zeudo Caixão as like this defending of humanity against holiness, let's say.
Yeah, I guess like it happens with a lot of like this kind of like cult figures in genre film. Like you can go to like kaiju films where they like start being this kind of like antagonist figure, and by the third or fourth film they're just like clearly like the heroic figures. I wouldn't say that's fully the case with Zeudo Caixão, but in the just like the beginning of the next film, Estranhos Velhos Prazeres, there's like this like whole ritual sequence of like naked young ladies invoking Zeudo Caixão. So he almost becomes this kind of like icon figure as well. And in that film, it's very interesting because it's also like barely a Zeudo Caixão film. You can also tell that's just like introduced as like a marketing gimmick, because the rest of the film is like Mojica Marin's kind of trying to do like old dark hotel on the road kind of film. Unassuming group of like young people find this like place that is looking for like a tenant for just to stay for one night, and they naturally suffer a lot. From the ones I've seen, of one of the most like experimental ones, because like the latter half of the film is just like sequences of like bright, like psychedelic, like vibrant colors and torture, and you just have like intercut with like a Zeudo Caixão kind of reacting, just like laughing and like moving his hands and things like that. But I think it's perhaps like the lesser Zeudo Caixão film I've seen, but I think for completionists it's of interest. I actually haven't seen the one you watched, Christopher.
Delirios Deum Abnormal, Hallucinations of a Deranged Mind. Yeah, I mean that one I think from the way you described the Hostel film, it's like that, but even more so. I mean, it's interesting that like I'm not sure I can think of another filmmaker whose like default cynical cash grab film was a meta film about himself and about the character he created. Because this film, I mean, to call it a film is also kind of generous, because basically it's essentially a clip show made out of the footage shot for the other films, for the hell sequences, and like boy, they clearly shot a lot of it. And also when I went, then as I said, I went back and watched the other films, and it's not even like outtakes. It's also they just use the same shots again. But it's another meta film that it's this psychiatric doctor to have like horrible nightmares and visions of Zeudo Caixão torturing people where? In hell, of course, because that's where the footage was shot. Literally just like for these nightmare sequences, a shot of the psychiatrist, like who's having the nightmare, like just a shot of his plain unadorned shot of his face looking scared, and then 15 minutes of torture in hell is like the Kuleshov effect if like they didn't cut back to the man, you know. Like you forget that you're supposed to be watching some kind of vision. But then the kind of wraparound aspect of it, which is like again and again in these films, is that the colleagues of this kind of psychiatrist, tormented psychiatrist called José Mojica Marins, and ask him like, please, can you come and like talk to him and like talk him out of these visions and so on. Like those scenes are good. The rest of the movie is like about as cynical as it comes. And I mean it's also an important film to see in a sense, because it's like that he's just at a point where like this is the kind of movie that might sell. That's kind of the last moment. That's like after that he goes away from it, and after that he made this like quite sudden turn into pornography, but that I understand it are also like on some level sort of lightly satirical. The one is called The Fifth Dimension of Sex, then 24 hours of explicit sex.
There's 48 hours then.
Yeah,
48 hours of hot sex.
Hallucinatory sex. This is Mojica after all. So, but I guess that's another episode for the future, maybe, if we're feeling adventurous.
Copia essa. Bem, pessoal, Por hoje chega, hein? Continua amanhã.
Even after like a Strange Hostel Naked Pleasures, they're the deep cuts, but like Como Consolar Viuvas and Inferno Carnal, those films still have like cult reputation. Once you get to Delirious de un Anormal, that's like, yeah, like what people consider like the nadir of his filming career. But he also was doing like a lot of like TV at the time. Basically, he introduced the films, kind of like a Hitchcock Presents and like a amalgamation of short films, like horror short films, introducing like B movies and like trashy like horror films. At that point, he's also kind of like continuously invited to like Sitges and like Phantasmagoria festivals and like a lot of like film festivals built around like genre cinema, which is interesting to think about. When he was at some point of his career, he seemed to be like consciously trying to avoid doing that, but like Embodiment of Evil kind of like shows like leaves me at ease that he found a way to like close that chapter in a nice, I don't want to say nice perhaps, but in a way that felt fitting.
Embodiment of Evil is the third like official quote unquote film in this trilogy, and Mojica always said that he intended to make a trilogy like from the start. The reason I find that really strange is because each of the films ends with Zé de Caixão's death. And so in the next movie, he has to invent a new like prologue why he survived. You know, you make a film, you don't expect it to be a hit, and then you want to cash in afterwards. But then you make a second film, you say that you want to make a trilogy, and then you end that film with him dying, like really explicitly, like he goes into a swamp, he's dead, everybody says he's dead. And then in Embodiment of Evil, they kind of restage, like shot also on black and white film stock with a new guy playing Zé de Caixão, him not dying. Kind of bizarre. Like, no, if you always claim this was a trilogy, why do you keep killing the main character at the end of each film?
There's even an end quote in the second film, like, this is what happens to people who don't believe in morale or something. Like, didn't
he convert to Christianity by the end of the second film?
Yes, he asked for the cross from the priest.
What did you guys think of Embodiment of Evil? Are you late film enthusiasts?
It like caters towards like a very specific sensibility I have, like of enjoyment of like this like horrible, trashy, like Monster Energy drink kind of like 2000s torture porn films, which were kind of like one of my first hooks into cinephilia actually. That to me is kind of like fitting that he creates like a new metal, what I call new metal films, where this kind of like post-hostel, like shaky camera, everything's like very like brown and ugly, and also like just like the random like swipes and like camera movements in this film are like insane. I have to say, like, I really dig all of those things, and I really appreciate like that Mojica Marin's kind of like goes for that, because he didn't really like needed to do that. Like any instance of like a half-assed like Zé de Caixão film would have done like the part, but he decided to engage with what like the horror film sensibility at the time was, which to me is also like very interesting to see. I see you frowning.
I'm not a big fan of that film, but I see what you admire in those films, let's say. But I think the social aspect or the change within the scenery is interesting, because now we're in Sao Paulo, and the forces of the evil, let's say the townsfolk, is replaced by the police forces. So this typical violence within the community is something that he also, not necessarily like central in the film, but kind of at least tries to give us space within the film. So I find that really interesting as well. As you said, the aesthetic qualities of the film was obviously intentional to be very ugly. The absence of the expressionist lighting, let's say, that we had in the previous films is interesting, because he definitely like experiments with that. But what I loved, like this really particular image, that when he sees the ghosts from his past, they're all black and white, like at least it's grayish blue white figures, as if they literally came from those films.
I obviously see the limitations of this film. It's like pretty obvious, but at the same time, you know, I really appreciate the gesture. As Alonso said, I can imagine a much lazier version of this, whereas in fact what I see is just a kind of the film of a like much older man, completely out of time. And clearly I think the connection with like Hostel and Saw and movies like that is interesting, because I felt like a sense of pride on Mojica's part, that like he's like, no, I'm this guy. I was the guy who was gouging people's eyes out in 1964, which is like genuinely impressive. Like when you watch those early movies, like, I think those are probably the most violent oldest movies I've ever seen.
Even before Fulci.
Yeah, even before Fulci, exactly. Yeah, like it was Fulci avant la lettre in a way. What I like about Embodiment of Evil is this like feeling that he's like, okay, I was that guy, I did that. You guys are here with your hostels and your saws. I'm gonna go even further, and he kind of does. I mean, it's pretty ugly movie, especially towards the end. I mean, when they put the rat inside the woman, it's really, really ugly. And he's willing to cross lines in a way that, like, the overall vibe of the movie, particularly towards the start, you don't really expect. You know, it's this kind of lighthearted thing. And he's a bit ridiculous, of course, because he's much older and whatever. And then just like the film is willing to go somewhere much darker.
It's also interesting what you said, because the fact that he has disciples in the film also joins this idea. So he's like, I'm not alone. You guys are like following me. So I'm the OG.
And a lot of them are very hot women who are willing to fuck him, and also to fuck him like in the end of the movie back to life. Sorry, spoiler alert for the audience.
Even in comparison to those like American torture porn films, the degree of misogyny that he like willfully embraces in this film is even for the times, to me, it's kind of, oh wow, he really doesn't care about this at all.
Even in the one of the first lines is like the police, when they're like releasing him, he's like, the policeman scolds the other officers like, if you keep doing that, I'm gonna put you into the queers ward. Like, this is like one of the first lines of the film. I
mean, I'm not gonna defend that, but like it goes to this idea that like he was always this kind of force with like very fucked up edges and like lots of contradictory feelings, like hate and like pride and like artistic triumph mixed with like real ugliness and whatever. And so it's, to me, it's all this like kind of combines into this weird admixture that you can't really differentiate. And yeah, I mean, this is a very different kind of film, much more low-key in some ways, at least. You feel that, like, this... Suddenly it's 2008. You know, it's not 1968 anymore. And it's a bit like, okay, what's this? He's still at least attempting to make these... I don't know whether they're conscious or unconscious, but gestures towards the kind of violence of broader society. You mentioned it about the favelas also. Like, there's constant allusions to police violence in the favelas, and one character at one point, if I remember correctly, he's kind of scheming against the Caixão, and he tells his friend, oh, but if we do this, the police have promised that they won't raid us for a while in the favelas. So there's like those, the same as in the early movies, there are those hints of like, yes, Zé de Caixão is a monster, but look at Brazil.
His relationship to Brazil has always been like integral part of it. I don't think like the first international reception, particularly in the US, really got to that necessarily. Like Brazilian like, traditional religion, also like with a conservative context of like the military like dictatorship. So yeah, that element, seeing that also like keep in touch and that constant dialogue, not only aesthetically with a horror film, but also with like Brazilian society, to me, is also shows that clear intent. I wouldn't say like his authorial voice, but his like impulse and his like curiosity as an artist in general.
I think the challenging aspect of this whole maybe discourse in his film is that there's no like a moral outcome that will just ease our consciences and just go on our merry ways, because it's still like some ideas about the religion you can't help but like you're kind of right there. You just can't help but saying that, even though these are really conservative ideas. But it's just like there are also pure evilness in what he's doing. So it's kind of impossible to just like create let's say a compromise between those discourses. It also leaves you in a more perplexed state of regarding maybe conservative ideas of Catholicism, more disillusioned perspective of atheism or materialism. So you're like in between those ideas and you just don't know what he's actually trying to say. Maybe he's not trying to say anything, which is a challenging thing for like a normal audience, because you, especially these horror films, by their nature, they need to give you a certain moral of the story, or like kind of should work as a parable, in more traditional sense at least. But these films are not that.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, we mentioned it before, but I guess that's what these other filmmakers were jealous of in some way. That I mean, of course, we don't want to buy too much into a mythology of like someone who's not thinking about what they're doing and it's all just natural. But he does represent that in a way. Like he does represent someone who's able to like pull at contradictions in a very ugly and interesting and complex way without that seeming to be the point, you know? Like even when I think about some of the Júlio Bressani films that I really love, and Bressani was he, on the record as saying that Mojica was really one of his heroes. You know, it's much more intellectual. Like he's even when he's adopting a genre, even when he's like reconfiguring something, he's doing it on an intellectual level. Whereas with someone like Mojica, I guess it's just this kind of torrential force that happens to be, you know, ripping trees up by their roots and pulling everything along. I did find it interesting that Embodiment of Evil was dedicated to Scansella. Mojica said that, like, during his kind of most fallow period, where he really was a bit lost, those guys, Scansella, Bressani, even Glauber Rocha before he died, really kind of helped sustain him in some way. Like, they gave him a sort of approval for the intellectual circles that helped Mojica's sense of self-dignity, I guess. And so to come back in his very last film to make a little gesture like that to Scansella is really, really nice.
No, I just wanted to add that I think in the history of horror, it's inevitable that at some point, like, we have this figure, like, doing stuff very unconsciously that other filmmakers are jealous of. And when we come to today, all the horror genre is now reduced to, like, self-referencing or referencing to the history of horror cinema. So I think that's what makes him so different than the horror ulterior horror films.
We need more unfiltered scam artists making horror movies. They're thinking too much and then not like ripping off themselves enough.
Terás o filho que queres. Vim te levar.
Afaste-se! Afaste-se! Não!
Pode me beijar agora.
So, guys, what have you been watching other than Zé do Caixão? Anything interesting?
Yeah, I wouldn't say interesting, but I did see this contemporary horror film called Sinners. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's an up-and-coming filmmaker called Ryan Coogler, which was promised to me to be some kind of like industrial approximation to exploitation film. And to much of my surprise, wasn't actually the case.
All of its exploitation credentials are in the fucking toilet to get an Oscar nomination. I think it's the most Oscar-nominated film ever, if I understand correctly, which is shameful for a film like this.
So yeah, like I tried to give it like a fair chance. And actually, the reason I only seen it now is because I trying to avoid being just a contrarian and hating on like any like hype contemporary genre film. But it was essentially what I feared the most, which is kind of like this like consistently middlebrow kind of like approach to like genre signifiers, where there's like a lot of gestures towards like Western and Southern Gothic and like exploitation film, but they aren't really integrated in the form itself and the film's thrust. So it feels almost like an academic detachment it has from the source genre or material it's supposed to be engaging with. Which is like a problem I have with a lot of contemporary horror, like A24, Neon, and well, basically any iteration of this like auteurist, academy-approved like approximation to horror filmmaking. I feel it's essentially like far away gone from the kind of like aspects that I look for in exploitation film or in genre cinema in general. And I think Sinners suffers a lot from this kind of like conceptual detachment, this kind of like being like too cool for school in terms of like engaging with the film it's actually making. So for me, like there are clear examples of what it's supposed to be doing that to me are kind of like particularly dabbling. The first one is like at the much discussed like sequence where you see like this pan, like the camera pans and during like a party where it's like celebration of like a black culture and black music historically. So you see like bluegrass music being played that transitions into jazz music that transitions into hip hop. And it's very cringy because it's like the text of the film is kind of like putting itself out there, and also the way it's filmed, it's just like very like orchestrated, very like artificial in a sense that doesn't really align with the film's general tone. It feels like almost this kind of like directorial bombast that again feels very stilted to me. And then there's this moment again, because I saw a lot of discourse online about how this film was supposed to bring back some of the less savory aspects of like genre film that weren't being shown in like American mainstream filmmaking, particularly in regards with sex. And then I see like the sex scenes are like wide open shot, everyone's fully clothed, and it's like, oh, okay, so that's the bar now, I guess.
This is the sex you're promising? What is that?
Yeah, they need to get on the Zeta Caixão version of sex positivity.
I like Creed a lot, actually. What Ryan Coogler's like foray into Rocky, the Rocky mythos. And I think he kind of works like as an industrial hack. So I don't really get why he has to now engage with this kind of like populist filmmaking, if you will, in such like a middle brow approximation, like signaling towards like prestige filmmaking. To me, it's always weird when they do that. So yeah, I'm not a fan of Sinners. Yeah.
I mean, Marty Supreme is a bit like this. The Brutus is a bit like this, where they're just kind of like I think probably of those films, Sinners is maybe the least convincing as an object for me. But like they are kind of winking at the kind of films that they want to be, rather than actually just being those movies. And I think like the second half of Sinners, or the last third, where it just kind of becomes a vampire movie, is like much better for me, you know, like whereas the first half with that awful sequence that you described, it's like very kind of postmodern. It's always winking at you, like it's aware of the kind of movie that it's trying to position itself to be, and that's just so annoying, you know. And then at the end it just becomes more or less a vampire movie, and then it's like, well, why couldn't you be this movie the whole time, you know? Why couldn't those gestures you were making just be subtext?
Yeah, I guess like Sinners to me is like a little bit more offensive in that sense, and like Marty Supreme or The Brutalist, because those films are kind of like signaling or like posturing to be like this kind of like traditional prestige film, whereas like in Sinners, they're kind of like imposing that like respectability on like a genre or like a tradition of genres aren't supposed to be. So yeah, it's kind of like even more like jarring to me, particularly as someone that has been established that really enjoys kind of like exploitation and trash films. So to see like someone come and commodify aspects of it for like, I don't know, like some kind of like radical chic Academy approved like thumbs up is I don't know, like particularly jarring. So yeah.
I mean, I didn't notice while watching it, but I read something about Sinners, and it actually kind of uses the Marvel formula with the whole like survival aspect of the group, the end credit sequence. So I think even like when he tries to appropriate the genre elements, I think Ryan Coogler ends up looking like a Marvel director.
Which to me is like the most scathing thing that you can say about any filmmaker.
What about you, Oku?
Been kind of following from afar what's going on in Rotterdam. I mean, Rotterdam is always a hit and miss festival, so I'm glad that this year I didn't go, but I just like followed what other people were watching. So I kind of followed in their steps, and I got a chance to watch this film called Chronowiser by Kevin Walker and Jack Owen. It's a first feature, and I was reading a lot of praises before watching it, and I think it definitely gives the pleasure of the expectations. But maybe it's because also something the elements, the themes that explored in the film are things I really like. It reminded me a lot of Courtney Stevens' films Invention and John Lilly. This parascience aspect explored through the lens of fiction is something I like. It's a really specific genre, I know, but the film is about, the Chronowiser is about French academic she's more like a neuroscientist, but she's interested in this machine that is supposedly invented by Benedictine monks that is capable of functioning like a camera to capture moments from history. Like there's the whole like science lingo that explains how particles of images and sounds are recorded in the memory of history, and this machine is capable of recording it. So she goes into this rabbit hole of research about this particular Benedictine monk that is supposed to like created this machine, but there's this whole conspiracy involving Vatican or this invisible forces. And if you are in academia at some point in your life, you know when you're onto something, and it just creates this this really intense feeling of at the verge of finding something. And I think it really captures that feeling. It's a really heightened feeling. I think in this case it's more like a science fiction or like a fantasy idea, but I think the intensity of that feeling when you're like researching through books or on the surface of a book is really palpable. And I personally felt that, and this literal tension, like literary tension on the surface of the book, they really capture in the film. I think a lot of parts of the film is just like it's just two-dimensional book surfaces, just like quotes, images, and text dialoguing with each other. And I mean, I think it's such a challenging and a courageous thing to try, and the outcome is really successful. I really liked it.
Rotterdam's existence in January kind of sets the tone for 2026 films. But for me, my version of that is always like the January releases that get dumped in cinemas. And this is where I go fishing for gold, and often you find something special waiting for you. Often with those films, like at least for me, with my sensibilities, it's very easy to overreact, because like I want to believe in the film that the studio dumps in the worst time of the year and is gold. But this year I actually did find gold. Same as a lot of people is Sam Raimi's Send Help. I'm not a Raimi head. Actually, I'm not really kind of schooled in that science. So I was super delighted to discover this film, which, I was kind of also expecting this sort of late style. I mean, he's not that old, but this sort of late style film is a little bit out of time. And it's a bit out of time in the sense that movies now suck. Like movies like this suck, and this one doesn't. It's a plane crash desert island movie, starring an amazing, as always, Rachel McAdams. It's her and this Dylan O'Brien, who's mostly a TV actor. They get stuck on this island, and they're kind of like colleagues in the corporate office. He's the boss, and she's like the kind of shrewish office lady with egg salad on her face that everybody makes fun of. And when they get to the island, it turns out that she had been auditioning for the TV show Survivor, and therefore she knows how to take care of them. Like, this movie is like so delightful, but it is also willing to go to a certain darkness that is like that is Mojica-esque at times, and like it's kind of surprising. Like the movie I just described to you is like kind of how the movie is for about 40 minutes, and then it starts to change and go to darker places. Like the thing to say is like Raimi is always in control of like the tonal shifts in this film, which is surprising because they're quite sort of manic. But it's just like, for me, the biggest pleasure in this movie was just seeing an actual director, like someone who knows how to direct a movie, approaching every scene, whether it's a scene in a corporate office, whether it's a scene on a desert island, whether it's a scene with a crazy evil boar. He's always looking for like, how do I shoot this scene? And the like the darkness and the violence in the film like really progresses as it goes along without ever losing the sort of like mixture of like goofy comedy and blood and guts that like people know from Raimi's films.
Okay, folks, I think that's all for today. In our next episode, we'll be talking about Shimizu Hiroshi's cinema with our guest David Phelps, who wrote a beautiful text about him in our third issue that you can also order online from our website. And before we wrap up, we also like to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Otti, who contacted us after listening to John Micklin Silver episode, and who mentioned to us that they've been watching her films last year, and listening to podcasts made them also reconnect and reappreciate her cinema. And they also mentioned their own favorite, which is Finnegan Begin Again, an HBO film. So if you're still discovering John Micklin Silver cinema, there you go, another recommendation for you guys. And like Otti, if you want to share your recommendations or appreciations about the podcast, your complaints, your regrets maybe, anything you want to share, do not hesitate to contact us at outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our podcast on any platform of your preference. And see you next week.